And welcome everyone to the Crimson Tide Sports Network Facebook page. This is Roger Hoover. Hope you're doing well on this Wednesday afternoon. It's time for another edition of Quarantine Q&A, and today we'll be visiting with the longtime voice of Alabama football, Eli Gold. And today we're presented by Alabama One Credit Union. They're voted Tuscaloosa's best credit union and best mortgage lender. Alabama One offers low-rate auto, mortgage, and business loans, plus protection for all of it with Alabama One Insurance. Make sure you visit any of our 9 local branches, or you can check them out online at alabama1.org. Alabama One, a proud supporter of Crimson Tide Athletics. And with that, we go to Eli Gold, who joins us via Skype. Hello, Eli. Roll Tide. How's everything going?
I am well, Roger. How are you doing? I'm fine. And quarantine Q&A. So my wife, Quarantina, she's outside working in the in the garden, but Claudette and I are doing just fine. Thank you.
Well, we're certainly glad to visit with you, and thank you for carving out some time with us, as this is normally a very busy time of the year for you, calling Alabama baseball or softball on SEC Network Plus, and of course going to football practice, getting ready for A-Day. But what have the last few weeks been like for you, Eli?
Well, like everybody, just kind of sitting around, and in our case, we have taken all of these stay-at-home directives very seriously. We have not been off of our property in three and a half weeks now, whatever it is. We're staying in. We're using one of the online apps to get groceries delivered. We're just kind of keeping to ourselves. I've had a few projects here for Crimson Tide Sports Network, the repackaging of the football games and this type of interview and so on. But otherwise, the best thing that's happened to me here in the last few weeks is I was told that I was named the captain of the U.S. Olympic Lazy Boy sitting team. I really have, and I've taken that to heart. So I've really been spending a lot of time in the Lazy Boy. I've been reading a lot of books and just, like everybody, hoping for the best here.
Certainly do hope for the best. And in your time in that Lazy Boy, have you been able to catch up and watch some old sports? I mean, of course, sports, again, are such a huge part of your life. What have you been doing to kind of watch and keep your mind engaged with the sports scene?
I have. I watched Monday Night Football the other night. They're replaying, and they had the game of the reopening of the Louisiana Superdome. They had that on Monday night. I've watched that. I've watched some hockey. I've watched some old auto races. But not a whole ton of them, but just enough. And I've really, I love old television. I've watched a lot of Andy Griffith shows, a lot of Perry Masons. Mr. Berger still hasn't beaten Perry. It's remarkable. I don't know how the guy kept his job. I don't know how he kept his job as the DA, but Hamilton Berger has still not beaten Perry. But no, I've done a lot of that. But I've been reading a good bit, and I've redone my files. You can't see them here, but I've got filing cabinets, and I've cleaned out the files, and I put stuff away and made a little busy work. And other than that, just hanging around, sitting on the back deck and listening to the birds and so on.
Well, that's certainly a good plan, as all of us, again, try to adjust to the stay-at-home directives from our local governments during this time of COVID-19. And the sports world on March 12th just really came to a very abrupt halt. Just what was your first reaction? Is there anything from the past in your career you can kind of look back on and say maybe it was a little bit similar, or is this truly unprecedented from what you've seen?
Well, the only somewhat similar situation was when the weekend of football was canceled in the aftermath of 9/11. That was obviously something that at that point was necessary and unprecedented. But anything of a long-term nature like this, no, I've never encountered it. I had just come back from a hockey trip. I was up in Illinois doing hockey for 3 games up there, and then came back, and I was getting ready for a Wednesday or a Tuesday baseball broadcast. And that turned out to be a game that never was played. So it was very, very quickly, everything shut down. And, it was just very, it was disappointing. It was a concern. And, you don't know what the future holds. That's what was so concerning at the time. But no, it was unprecedented. Other than losing that Southern Miss football game back in after 9/11, a game that was eventually, of course, rescheduled for a Thursday night. But exclusive of that, no, there's been no comparison whatsoever.
It certainly has been an unprecedented time, and with that, of course, no baseball, no softball to broadcast during the spring, and A-Day will have something special across the Crimson Tide Sports Network. But one of the cool things we've decided to do is re-air some classic football games from the Nick Saban era, and that's been going on Saturdays on radio stations across the state. It started a couple weeks ago with the 2008 Clemson game. 2009 Tennessee was last week, and then the Iron Bowl for 2009 will be coming up this Saturday. So let's talk a little bit about the early days of the Nick Saban era. And
Sure.
First of all, even before we get to some of the classic games that we are re-airing, what was the 2007 season like for you, getting to know Coach Saban for the first time and watching his team at Alabama for the first time?
Well, I had known Coach Saban as well as any broadcaster from another city was able to do, because I had done interviews with him when he was at LSU. It was, you knew the guy was good. You knew the guy was good. I don't know if I realized how quickly he was going to turn things around. We had this function, and I don't think they do it any longer, but it was on like the first Monday when school had opened. And they had all the freshmen come to Bryant-Denny Stadium. I think we called it Bama Blast or Bama Bash. The name kind of escapes me now. But we had this gathering where not just student athletes, but all the freshmen came to Bryant-Denny. The $1 Million Band was there to teach them the words to Yay, Alabama. There were local businesses represented. There were a lot of coaches there just to welcome these freshmen to class or to campus. Well, we had it for years, but the football coach never attended because it was right in the middle. It was like at 3 p.m, and it was right in the middle of football practice. So the football coaches always would tape a message to the freshmen, and we'd play it on the video screens at Bryant-Denny. And all of a sudden, I went to Coach Saban, and I said, Coach, here's what we got going on. When would you like to tape it? Why would I want to tape it? Can I do it in person? And I said, well, certainly you can do it in person. I said, but none of the other coaches ever have. He said, well, when does it start? I said, it starts at 3 o'clock on Monday, whatever the date was. He goes, okay, I'll be there at 3:01. Well, 3 o'clock, there I am. It was hot, hot, hot. I was sweating from places I didn't even know I had. And I'm standing there in the middle of the field at Bryant-Denny. There are like 5,000 freshmen and mom and dads and grandma and them. And the band was there. And I'd said, hello, everybody. I did a big welcome. And I'm looking at the clock, and it's 3 o'clock and 10 seconds. No Nick Saban. 3 o'clock and 30 seconds. No Nick Saban. 3 o'clock and 40 seconds. Here comes Nick Saban. Trots out, grabs the microphone after I give him a nice introduction. He talked 3.5, 4 minutes. And Roger, he was absolutely spectacular. Now, he was not recruiting anybody. These were kids who were already at Alabama, student athletes and the regular student body. But he was there to get everybody involved, to tell them how they are part of this program and how the student participation is so important, something he talks about to this very day. And when he was done, I was ready to go out and hit somebody. He was good. And I'm driving back to Birmingham after the function was over, and I called my wife on the phone, and I said, Claude, now I know why this guy is such a great recruiter. I said, the people, young and old alike, he had everybody eating out of his hand. It was remarkable. And that's, again, even more when I realized this guy's good and this is going to be spectacular. Now, did I imagine after the Independence Bowl against Colorado, that the Clemson game the next season would start this meteoric rise. I don't know if I was that foresighted to see that, but it sure as heck did, didn't it?
It sure did, and as I talked about John Parker Wilson, and we are going to interview a legend from all of these games that will re-air coming up. We talked about all the conversation, it seemed like, especially from a national perspective, was on Clemson, the dynamic running game they had, and the fact that they should win the ACC and could contend for a spot in the BCS title game down the road. But at the end of the game, and really before the second half was over, the conversation was all Alabama. Is that how you felt in the booth?
Definitely. Bama scored early and often. That was an interesting situation, though, for us. That was the year where I had 12 or 13 different color men working alongside of me. Snake had left. Phil Savage hadn't come in yet, and we were basically doing auditions on the air for a new analyst. So it was a totally different season anyway. Every week I was talking to somebody on the phone, telling them, here's how you got to do it. Here's to tell you how weird it was. And I won't mention the guy's name so as to not embarrass him. But we're doing a game with one of our one-time visitors. And I said to the guy, I said, whoa, that was a great play by such and such. And such happened to play the same position as my guest analyst did. So I said to myself, boy, this is great. I'll tee him up and he can say, yeah, that was a great play because yada, 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 yada. So I said on the air, I said, well, man, I said, that was a great play. He handled that beautifully, didn't he? And my color man looked at me and he went, that's exactly what he did.
Doesn't work on radio.
At me. And I hit my cough switch. I turned my mic off, and I reached over and turned his mic off. And I looked at him. I said, "You got to say something." So the whole season was unusual, but starting off the way they did, scoring early and often against Clemson, that was very impressive. And of course, we all know how that season progressed. It was a spectacular year.
Certainly was, with the big wins down the stretch, going 12-0 in the regular season. Everyone still talks about the blackout game at Georgia. What do you remember about that game specifically?
Well, two things. I remember talking to Coach Gene Stallings. We'd always stayed in touch. I was doing the games when Coach Stallings had the head coaching role and won a national title. And I talked to him before the game, and I remember him saying to me, he goes, well, if you got them worrying about what they're going to wear, we got that game in the bag. And but I'll tell you, going into the game, yes, Alabama had played all right. But, how good truly was Clemson? You just didn't know after the way Bama handled them. Then you had a couple of weaker opponents, if I remember correctly. So now it's week 4, and you're saying, well, let's see what this is all about. And I remember leaving Sanford Stadium that night in Athens and walking back to the car and saying to myself, well, I believe we got something special here. I remember saying that because you just didn't really know. You knew they were good, but how good? And again, when you whip up on Clemson in week 1, like you did, well, it was great for Bama, but, how good is Clemson really going to be? I mean, so there were questions. But walking back to the car that day, I said to myself, now, we got ourselves a ball club here. So I remember that vividly. I really do.
And that turned out to be, of course, a special season, winning the SEC West, and then everything really fueled the run in 2009 that Alabama would have en route to a championship. You mentioned something as well. Your radio partner, Phil Savage, comes in for the 2009 season, and when I was driving around Tuscaloosa on Saturday listening to the 2009 Alabama-Tennessee game, I heard another guest that dropped by the booth, and he's somebody that's dropped by the booth many, many times over the years, Joe Namath, the Alabama legend, the NFL Hall of Famer. Just how much do you enjoy getting to see him usually once or twice a year at Bama games?
Well, I love it. You see, going back to my youth, I grew up in New York City, as many folks know. And in those days, the New York Giants, the New York football giants, had a waiting list for tickets that was, well, like Alabama. It was like 50,000 names on the waiting list for tickets. So my dad and I couldn't get season tickets, but the New York Titans, they were the predecessors to the Jets in the American Football League. The Titans played at the Polo Grounds. And when Shea Stadium was built, at the end of the runway for LaGuardia Airport, the Titans moved to Shea Stadium, and because of the proximity to the airport, they were renamed the Jets. So my dad and I had season tickets at that point at the new stadium, at Shea Stadium, and Joe Namath was the Jets quarterback. So I was always a fan of Joe. I loved everything he is, I loved everything that he was involved with. The other thing was that I first met Joe intimately when he showed up at I guess it was the bowl game in Miami when Bama played Colorado. The Blockbuster Bowl, it might have been called at that time, I forget. In any event, Joe comes into the booth. Well, here I got Snake sitting to my right. I got Joe Willie sitting to my left. I mean, I thought I had gone to football heaven. I mean, this was unbelievable. Well, I was smart enough to just call the play and hush up. And between the plays and even halftime, instead of turning it back to whoever was doing halftime at the time, probably Tom Roberts, we just kept the conversation going. It was spectacular. I mean, it was great radio. Not because of my questions, I guarantee you, but because these guys, the stories they were telling. And Joe enjoyed it, and Snake enjoyed it. I loved it. And we just made it a regular date. Whenever Joe came to Tuscaloosa or wherever where we were playing, he was always welcome, and he'd come to the booth. He wouldn't necessarily spend a whole half like he did in that game against Colorado, but he's always welcome. And even to this day, like you say, he'll come to a game or two, and we always I'll always let him come on, ask him to come on. There's no letting. I'll ask him to come on, and he usually does, and we shoot the breeze a little bit, and it's a lot of fun. It really is.
We'll have some questions coming in from our Facebook page. Again, we're live on the Crimson Tide Sports Network Facebook, and Ryan Hall has a good question. Any memories of Doug Layton that you'd like to share?
Doug was he had a magnificent sense of humor. Nobody loved Alabama football and the University of Alabama more than Dougie did. He was just a great guy, had a sense of humor that was just unbelievable. Not many of the lines can I use on the air, unfortunately, but he had a wonderful sense of humor. But he was a nice man. He was just a genuinely nice man who loved the University of Alabama. And, you can't ask for anything more than that in that role. So I worked with Dougie Doo for 10 years, Snake for about a decade, then the 1 year of all the different analysts, and now then Phil, and now John Parker. So I haven't dealt with many analysts taking out that 1 year where we had so many. In these 32 years, it's been very little turnover.
And again, Phil Savage joined you in 2009, and one of the great games that we aired on Saturday was the 2009 Alabama-Tennessee game. Just what are your memories of that day, as Alabama was able to get 4 field goals from Tiffin, but otherwise the offense just couldn't punch it in the end zone, and kind of Tennessee at the end hung around to have a chance with Daniel Lincoln attempting a game-winning field goal, but it's a good thing that Terrence Cody was on our side.
And I got news for you. If Terrence Cody hadn't blocked it, I think other guys would have. If you watch that video closely, and I know you have, there were tons of guys in position to fly across in front, to jump up high in the back. That was an outstanding game. But I'm like the fans, man. I'm not good when Bama. I'd much rather broadcast of 52-0. I'd much rather do Alabama Notre Dame the way it turned out at the down in Miami than having a nail biter. So it was not pleasant. Even the national title game against Georgia, which Bama won in overtime. People say, "Man, that was a great game, wasn't it?" I said, "Well, no, the game actually stunk from my seat. Now the finish was great. I mean, when Tua hit Devontae, that was great." But the other 3.5 hours, I was a nervous wreck. So the same thing in that Tennessee game when Lincoln lined it up for the field goal. It was the same thing in 1989 when Bama went to Penn State and Ray Tarasi lined up that chip shot field goal from, the 3-yard line, the 4-yard line. Well, actually, they snapped it from the half-yard line. So he put total leather at around the 11. And I said, we took a commercial break, and I said, "Oh, this is awful, man. This is terrible. You're at Beaver Stadium. The place is going nuts. And, how does a guy miss a chip shot field goal?" Well, he did. It was a bad angle. Thomas Rayam came across and swatted it away. And, of course, Bama won. So it was the same thing when Lincoln was getting ready for that. And it was Tennessee, just to make it even more impactful, it would be bad enough to lose to Penn State, but Penn State's Penn State. We're not rivals. We're in different conferences, but this was Tennessee, man, and thank God Terrence was there to swat it away, and that was the ball game. And as it turned out, that led to a national championship.
Yeah, and a perfect season. And the next game we're going to have in our re-airing of these classic games in the Saban era will be coming up this Saturday with the 2009 Iron Bowl. And Christian asked, what's your favorite Iron Bowl you've ever called? I imagine that's one of the games that's up there, probably in your top 5 of Iron Bowls you've ever seen.
Yeah, no question. Any one that Bama wins is my favorite Iron Bowl. I can't, let's be honest. But yes, that one, that drive. Mm-hmm. I remember Nick Saban told us on the post-game show that was one of the greatest drives that he had ever been involved with in his football career. It was like an 80-yard drive or something. And I remember him telling us that on the post-game, that it was one of the greatest drives he had ever been a part of. And, with Terrence Cody there, and everybody thought that he was going to be the fullback to lead Upchurch in, and obviously they swung the pass out. So it was that was spectacular because it was an Iron Bowl, because it was at Jordan-Hare, all of those elements. That is one of the absolute best. One of the great ones, of course, is one I didn't call, is when Tiffin hit the 52-yard field goal. That was Paul Kennedy and Doug Layton on the call for that one, but I always enjoy watching the highlight of that. So, there have been some great games, but that 2009, which again contributed to the national championship, that made it so very impactful.
Always great to win at Jordan-Hare Stadium, and of course, so many Iron Bowls were played at Legion Field. And Amy asked you, what's your fondest memory of a game from Legion Field?
Wow. My fondest memory, and this is really personal, more so than athletic. It was the 1989 game against what was then called Memphis State, the University of Memphis, as we now know them, because that was my first game as the voice of the Tide. And I didn't know if there was going to be a second game. A lot of young folks may not remember that folks who are young now, my hiring was not at all a cause for celebration. A lot of folks had problems with me getting hired, and I was getting a lot of heat, and I was a nervous wreck. I was an absolute nervous wreck that day. Biggest mistake I made that day was getting to Legion Field like 5 hours before the game. We didn't have a 3-hour pregame like we do now. We had probably a 15 or 20-minute, 30-minute pregame at most. I got there early. I wanted to make sure there was no traffic. I had no car issues, whatever. Well, I got there like 5 hours before kick, and it was just me alone in the press box, in the radio booth, and all I did was make myself a nervous wreck. I mean, I was shaking. I wanted to do some more notes. Honest to God, I was shaking. I could not even write a word on my piece of paper because I knew how much was on the line. You only have one chance to make that first impression. And that was going to be my first impression to a very judgmental audience that had a problem in those days with a guy from New York who was a pro sports broadcaster and who got no ties to the university. They have a lot of folks who had a lot of problems with me doing that, getting that position. Thank God, here we are 32 years later. But that will be, just like going back and doing my first ever broadcast from Madison Square Garden, a building where I used to have a ticket as a kid, where I used to sell peanuts, and then going back as a broadcaster. Well, the same thing in this setting. Of all the games I did at Legion Field, that was, that first one enabled me to do the next one and the next one and the next one. It was quite the day.
Certainly was, and certainly a great memory. Who were some of the people in your corner that helped you get the Alabama job?
Well, it's a funny story, quite honestly. There were two people who were keenly involved. Well, Steve Sloan was the athletic director in those days, okay? But he had designated a gentleman by the name of Tommy Limbaugh, who was his associate athletic director. Tommy was in charge of the search. Unbeknownst to me, now I never applied for the job. I was doing minor league baseball. I was doing the Barons. I was doing the National Hockey League at the time. And I mean, I was doing all sorts of stuff. I never applied for the job. I said to myself, I have absolutely no chance of getting this. Again, I'm a New Yorker with no collegiate ties who does nothing but pro sports. Well, Wimp Sanderson had heard me do some basketball. I had done some UAB games. I had done some other freelance stuff. And Wimp had heard somewhere, had heard my work. He got a hold of Tommy Limbaugh and said, we need to give this guy a listen. And I really didn't even know Wimp. But he, behind the scenes, I didn't have an agent. There was no back channel discussions. But Wimp, as I now know, was pushing me to Tommy Limbaugh. Then the word came out in the newspapers that I was on the short list. Well, I hadn't talked to a soul. And again, I had no agent. There was nothing going on behind the scenes. Then in the newspaper, it came out that among those coming in for an interview were such and such, and Eli Gold. Well, I had talked to nobody. So I found out who Tommy Limbaugh was. I mean, I knew who he was. I had had dealings with him in the past, but I found out how to get a hold of him. And I called him on the phone and I said, Mr. Limbaugh, I said, I don't know if you remember me. We've met a couple of times. My name is Eli Gold, and I understand I'm coming in for an interview, which was a good icebreaker. And he said, well, would you like to? I said, well, of course. Who wouldn't? And he said, well, come on down. So I went to the office probably the next day and met with Tommy Limbaugh and Wimp Sanderson and Bill Curry, who was the football coach at the time. And I left there with the basketball job. I did basketball for one season, and they brought John Forney back. John had done 29 years of football. Then Ray Perkins chose to make a change, and John was let go, and Paul Kennedy came in for 5 years. Well, they decided to bring John Forney back for his 30th year. And John did the games, and then after that football season, we were sitting at Thompson Bowling Arena in Knoxville. The day before Alabama was playing the Vols, I was there for the practice on the road. They were practicing that night because it was an early game the next day. There wasn't going to be a morning shoot-around. And Tommy Limbaugh came up, and we sat in the stands about 18 or 19 rows up, and he offered me the football job, and I promptly accepted. But that's how it happened. So Tommy made the call. It was his decision, I'm sure, in concert with others. But I could never thank him enough, and I always thank Wimp for keeping my name alive in that whole discussion.
Yeah, that leads us perfectly into the next question from our Facebook feed. Ryan wants to know some of your favorite memories of Wimp Sanderson, and now he's been one of your broadcast partners on SEC Network Plus, and I know fans have enjoyed that.
Wimp's a hoot, man. He is an absolute classic. There are so many stories. I mean, we don't have enough time here, but he was a great basketball mind. He could recruit like crazy. Obviously, with Ori and Sprewell and Rob, all those great teams that we had in Tuscaloosa. Obviously, his wardrobe was memorable. But every year, you either won the SEC tournament or you finished second to Kentucky. Every year you got to the round of Sweet 16 in the NCAA tournament. It was spectacular times. Of course, one of my favorite stories, and we probably don't have the time to tell it now, was the day in Wichita where Alabama was ranked like number 5 or 6 in the country, and Wichita State, God bless them, they were at that time not very good. And they were ranked like number 130, and the game took 5 hours to play because of a broken backboard and an unveiling of a new mascot for the Shockers and all of this stuff, and Bama lost this game on the road, and it was 2 degrees outside, and it was a mess. And I remember that day the game ended, and it was so late. I mean, literally, the game was stopped like for 3 hours for between halftime, and then on the first play of the second half, Marcus Webb broke the backboard and the rim, and they didn't have a backup there at the Levitt Arena where they played at that time. And long story short, the game finally ends. Bama loses, and it was so late that the newspaper guys were already past deadline. They couldn't wait for a press conference, so they all came out to courtside and formed a little semicircle around where I was doing the radio, and I was working by myself that night because Tom Roberts couldn't make the trip. So I was working by myself. He said, "Do you mind going to Wichita by yourself?" I said, "Well, what the heck can happen in 2 hours at Wichita?" I said, no problem. Well, anyway, Wimp comes out, and he puts his head, I don't know if you can see, he puts his arm on the table, puts his head on his arm like that, and he's looking at the floor. And there's these writers all ringing the front of the table. And we had done our commercial break at the end of the game. And I said, "All right, Wimp, we're coming back 10 seconds. And I said, "Welcome back to the Levitt Arena. Tough night. The Tide loses to Wichita State, yada, yada, yada. Coach Wimp Sanderson is with us." Wimp said, "What can you say? You just kind of walked into a buzzsaw tonight." I was just going to throw him a softball, let him take the answer wherever he wanted to. Well, he starts talking with his head still down like this. He's talking to the floor. So I quickly grabbed what we call a stick mic, a regular microphone, and I held it under the table like this, and he's talking to the floor, and I got the microphone all the way down here. And the newspaper guys are writing so fast, there's like smoke coming up off their notepads. And Wimp looked up, and Hootie Ingram was the athletic director at this time. And Wimp looked up at one point, and he goes, "I quit." He says, "Hootie doesn't have to fire me. I quit. I can't coach. This is awful, yada, 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 yada." And obviously he didn't quit and had many more successes. But working with Wimp, and even today, doing the SEC network games, working with Wimp is still a hoot. It's still a treat.
Certainly is, yeah. What great, unique character here at the University of Alabama. And, of course, you've gotten to work with so many coaches during your tenure with basketball, football, all the other sports. And I'm sure the approach with each coach is very different, especially with Coach Saban.
Definitely so. Coach Saban and I get along wonderfully. We really do. But we don't talk a whole heck of a lot. Now, if I have a question, he obviously is quick to answer it. When we're doing shows and we're doing a formal interview, I have his undivided attention. I mean, when we're doing the Nick Saban Hey Coach shows on Monday night from Baumhauer's Victory Grill, it's wonderful. We get along great, and he'll throw some barbs in my direction. And, I like that. That's fine. It shows that he's comfortable, that he's happy, and he's comfortable working with me. But I have talked so much more with every other coach as far as volume of conversation as opposed to Nick Saban. I'd go in and talk to Coach Stallings on a Friday night to tape our pregame show. We would talk for an hour and a half. Somewhere in the middle of that, I'd turn the tape recorder on. We used tape in those days. And I would do the pregame show. Mike Shula, we'd sit around, we'd talk about everything and anything. Whatever, what NFL game I was doing Sunday, what race I was going to go to. We'd talk religion. We would talk politics, subjects that I never discussed, but I did with him. My wife would be sitting in there with us, and Coach Shula's wife would be there. And we'd just be four people sitting around shooting the breeze, and eventually we'd turn the machine on. We would do the interview. Coach Saban, we tape that interview 2 hours before kickoff. We don't do it on Friday like I did with everybody else. 2 hours before kickoff. And when I say 2 hours, I mean 2 hours. If we play on CBS and they advertise the game as a 2:30 kickoff, well, as we all know, they actually put toe to leather at 2:37. Coach Saban and I don't meet at 12:30. We meet at 12:37. I mean, we're 2 hours out. And he'll walk in. I'll always, we'll exchange pleasantries. How are you? Say anything I need to know. Anything like that happened overnight, for instance. Anybody sick, what have you. Nope. Or there were a couple of times where he's told me, yes, he said, such and such is not going to start today. You won't see him in the first half. And he said, I'd rather you don't mention it on the pregame show. But when he's not out there to take his rightful position, you need to say, Joe Blow's not out there to start the game. And then when he's out there to start the second half, you can say, oh, Joe Blow is back out there. And I'd say, okay. And I'd say, is there any reason for me to ask you why Joe Blow is not starting the first half? And he'd look at me and say, no. And but he is very open in all seriousness. He'll tell me stuff, and he knows that I'm smart enough what to say and what not to say. But then we tape that show. We do it. And for that 15 minutes, I have his undivided attention. And then as soon as we're done, all right, man, thanks. I said, yes, sir, coach, see ya. He's out the door, I'm out the door, and we're off to, again, at that point, we're about an hour and 45 minutes to kickoff. So everybody is different. You handled Coach Franchione differently than Coach Dubose. Everybody, you learn what they like, what they don't like, and how much time. And, Coach Saban knows, and it was upon me to learn. He knew that as nice of a guy as old Eli is, he knew that talking to Eli for an hour and a half and shooting the breeze wasn't going to help Alabama win a football game. So he spent time with me, what I needed. And again, if I had a question, if I needed to reach him, I don't take advantage of that access a lot. But if there's a question, if I'll say, hey, man, I just don't understand this. And he'll explain something to me. I mean, he wants me to do well because I'm talking about his program. But we don't sit around and shoot the breeze for hours on end like I've done with many other coaches. But at the same time, you see this national championship ring. I didn't get a lot of those from those guys I sat around and talked to for an hour and a half. So it's a pretty good trade-off.
Absolutely. Of course, Coach Saban, as organized as he is, maybe some people don't know as organized as you are on football game days, and especially with what you have in the booth. One of the good things we've done on this Facebook page is the live cam that has a video feed of you, John Parker Wilson, and of course your spotter, Butch Owens, working so hard during the game. Can you just explain what your space is like in the booth when you call an Alabama game and kind of the role that Butch plays?
Well, Butch is my extra set of eyes in the booth. He is a spotter. That's the title of his position. Uh, During a normal play, I am responsible for the offense. I watch that football like a hawk. He will help me with the tackler, and I have this big chart in front of me, and which is loaded with statistics and biographical information, not only player statistics, but national statistics and team statistics. And I mean, you name it, this massive chart. One side has the Alabama offense, and over here is the other team's defense. Then you flip it over, and it's the other team's offense and the Alabama defense. But Butch will point to the guy who made the tackle, because sometimes I don't see it. I'm watching the ball. There are three guys in there, whatever it might be. Butch is responsible for that. Sometimes when a guy makes a great, the running back turns the corner, if I don't say instantly who made the block out there to allow him to turn the corner, Butch will point to that lineman's name, or the tight end, or whomever it might be, or the wide receiver. He'll point to that and go like this, which means he blocked it. There are a lot of hand signals we will use, if the ball was bobbled and fumbled, whatever, just in case I didn't pick up on it. Butch he's been with me for 32 years now, done all the games. He does my NFL games. He does anything I do for other networks. I do a lot of freelance work. I haven't done, even when I did arena football, Butch Owens has done every single football game that I have done in the last 32 years. John Parker Wilson sits to my right. To my left is has been our statistician over the years, Tom Roberts, and his son Brian Roberts, and then Jimmy Bank. And then you sit, or Chris would sit next to Jimmy. You were there this past season. So, and we're just I'm very organized. I am over prepared. One of my big sayings, and I tell this to young students, I talk to classes and what have you. I know what I don't know. I know what I don't know. And I'm not going to go on the air without knowing that stuff. I'm going to find it. Plus the fact I also understand my role. I'm a professional describer. I didn't play football. I didn't win a national championship. I didn't win a Super Bowl. Why would I think that I had any right to analyze a play when Kenny Stabler is sitting to my right, or Joe Namath is sitting to my left, or John Parker Wilson? I mean, those guys have been there and done that. Why would I venture into their turf? I don't need to prove to anybody that I do or don't know something. So I would venture a guess, and I've never timed it out with a stopwatch or anything, but I would guess that the color men on our broadcasts over the years have probably spoken more than color men on most any other broadcast. I describe it, get in, get out, and virtually every play allow the color man to come in. Sometimes you can't if there's a hurry up offense, or early in the game if you have to do something of a sponsorship nature. But I know what I don't know, and I'm going to defer to John Parker or to Rashad or to Snake or to Phil. I mean, they've been there and done that. So in that regard, I kind of keep myself where I am. But in the booth, that's what we've got. To get back to your original question, we have the chart. I have a format sheet to my left of all the commercials and all the live reads that have to get in. And it's my responsibility to make sure that those spots get in. And the other person we've not mentioned that I need to is the guy who is always in my ear, and that's Tom Stipe, who is arguably one of the best sports producers I have ever worked with. I've been blessed over the years to have worked for CBS and NBC, and I've worked a lot of sports for a lot of networks, and I've worked with Emmy award-winning producers. But Stipe is just so good. During the week, we'll bounce ideas off each other. I'll be doing the game, and he'll just pop into my ear while I'm talking. As we are all who do television, we can talk while somebody's talking in our ear, and Tom will say something that many times, 90% of the time, I will use. We were quick to tell you what I'm talking about. We were sitting in traffic on Nicholson Drive, which is the road right out in front of Tiger Stadium in Baton Rouge, and we're in traffic going to the game, and I don't know how the conversation came up, but I had rolled down the window. People were yelling at us, and somebody was there in a Hawaiian shirt. It was a Bama fan wearing a Hawaiian shirt in honor of Tua, and I waved back and I said aloha to the guy. He's eating boudin in the middle of Baton Rouge, but I said aloha, and I rolled the window back up and I said to Tom Stipe, I said, if Tua does something good today, I ought to give to our stations out in Honolulu. We have 2 radio stations out there. And I said, we need to give a welcome to those folks. And then I totally forgot about it. Game goes on. We're in Baton Rouge. Tua makes a huge play. He's running for a touchdown. And he's about at the 20-yard line. And Tom Stipe jumps into my ear and says, use it now. He said, use it now. And I realized what he was talking about. And I said, there goes Tua, aloha, and touchdown, Alabama. It's stuff like that Tom does. Plus, we write the teases to the broadcasts. Sometimes he has an idea. Sometimes I have an idea. We often collaborate. He's a major part of our broadcast, and of course our engineer as well.
And I know he's someone that you've talked with before Alabama plays for a significant game, whether it's a rivalry game, SEC championship, or a national title, helping you near the end of that ball game try to frame whatever moment happens in the right historical context. And I know that's something you've leaned on over the years.
We have. Tom and I will try and come up with an idea. We don't necessarily use the exact words, but we come up with the idea to start with. For instance, Texas national championship game at the Rose Bowl. As a lot of folks may or may not know, when Alabama back in the 20s went west to play in the Rose Bowl, Southern football was not an entity that was given any respect. It was the West Coast collegiate teams that were the powers in those days. Well, Bama goes out, they win a couple of games at the Rose Bowl. I mean, it was such a big deal. It's even in the fight song, remember the Rose Bowl. That was a big deal. Bama carried the Southern football on their shoulders. So I said to, Tom and I talked, and I said, we've got to do something about the Rose Bowl, whatever it was. And we tweaked the idea. I said, well, if Bama wins, I've got to use roses and crimson roses in the clothes. But I wasn't quite sure how we were going to do it. But, Tom had come up with the idea. He said, yeah, you need to do that. You need to use crimson and roses. And then I opened my mouth on the night of the game, and, Bama won, and the roses in this grand old stadium were once again crimson. But, that was his idea. One of the recent national championship games where Alabama has again climbed to the top of the college football mountain. That was a Tom Stipe line, and he gave it to me, and I've tried to. I do a lot of my good thinking on national championship days. I kind of rehearse, if you will, without knowing what I'm going to say, in the shower that morning. And I said, all right, how will this sound? Yada 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 yada. And I eventually came out with what we came out with. But the idea, the seed, and in some instances the wording itself came from Tom. I don't necessarily type it out on my paper, but it's in here. So if Bama wins, you can come up with something that ties it all together.
And that's, of course, easier said than done, but especially for the last game you referenced against Georgia, a lot of times you've had a national championship call or an SEC championship call on a kneel down or Alabama's running out the clock, but it was 2nd and 26, and it's arguably one of the most iconic calls of your career. Can you just take us back to what you were thinking right before that play and then the follow-through with the call?
Well, I was ticked off. I mean, Tua, you can't take a sack, but he did. And Phil Savage said, look, we got 2nd down and 3rd down and 4th down. Get bits and pieces of the yardage back. And I mean, I was like the fans, man. I was just, I had gone through all my fingernails. I was down to the cuticles. I mean, I was, but I called it. And obviously the game was won on that magnificent play to Devontae. Well, before the game, again, Tom Stipe and I had talked, and in Miami, the game was near South Beach, and we talked about, and the tide rolls up onto South Beach with another national championship, those kind of ideas. And then we just said, with no disrespect, but what the heck is there in Atlanta? It was like a ride on a Six Flags roller coaster. None of that's going to work. And then Tom said to me, this will be so huge, especially with Coach Saban tying Bear Bryant. He said, you just need to be historically, let's just do it historically, make it what it is. So Tom had come up with that line of, and Alabama's again climbed to the top of the college football mountain. And that was Tom's writing. Or I forget, he might have even given it to me before the game. He goes, what do you think about this? And then the game is over. And, Devontae Smith, Alabama wins, and the Crimson Tide again at the top of the college football mountain. And then I just went into the history. For the Crimson Tide, their such and such championship in the last 9 years. For Nick Saban, his such and such championship, tying him with the legendary Coach Paul Bear Bryant. Alabama, again, the champion of college football. But I'm live at this point, and my voice, I ended that sentence on an upward inflection. And I'm saying to myself instantly in my head, I said, I can't end like that. It's going to sound like something was wrong. I said, I need, 3 or 4 more words quickly. So I said, Alabama is again the national champion of college football. How about that? And the reason I said how about that was a bit of a tribute that came instantly to the late, great Mel Allen, the New York Yankees broadcaster, who always on a big play would say, how about that? But Mel Allen was also a former voice of the Crimson Tide when he was a student at the University of Alabama. So I said, all right, here's a tip of the old microphone to Mel Allen. And I said, how about that? And then I just shut up, let the crowd noise fill the speaker until then Phil said something. Then I said, Tua, aloha, thank you, aloha, hello, and mahalo, thank you. And then Chris jumped in with interviews. So that's how that played out. But I was as shocked as everybody. I didn't expect a touchdown on a 2nd and 26, and then how we wrapped it up. It's just, it was Tom's initial idea, and then I just added in the historical significance.
Well, that was a perfect wrap-up for that great moment as Alabama won its 17th national title. And as you and I start to wrap up this conversation on Facebook, obviously we have a lot of unanswerable questions about what's next for Crimson Tide football. We do know that here on the network we will have, of course, the Classic Games re-airing. Coming up next will be next Saturday's game, upcoming Saturday, with the 2009 Iron Bowl against Auburn. But then the next week is when we are all expecting to be at Bryant-Denny Stadium for A-Day. But I understand we do have something special planned for A-Day that you'll be the host of.
Yeah, we've got a talk show coming up, and I don't know if the show has a name yet or what have you, but it'll be myself, John Parker Wilson, Rashad Johnson, Greg Byrne, and Nick Saban. And as I understand it, with the help of Tom Stipe and our friends at the Learfield IMG College, I'll be here, probably in this very same seat. I've got radio gear sitting right here behind me. We'll have radio gear for John Parker Wilson, where you interviewed him a couple of weeks ago. Rashad will get a piece of equipment at his home. Greg Byrne, I assume, will have a piece at his house. And Coach Saban will be given a piece of equipment. That's my understanding. It could change. The show won't change. How it's technically done could change, but that's my understanding. And we're going to sit around and shoot the breeze for 2 hours. Greg Byrne was very insistent on taking questions from the listeners. And I said, of course. I said, this is the Hey Coach Nick Saban show kind of format, even though it was supposed to have been a ball game. But it'll just be like one of our, regular Thursday night shows or the Monday shows that you and Chris have done during the spring and summer. So yeah, we'll be on for 2 hours, and I've put together a bunch of notes. That chart I had talked about that I always have in the booth, I'm putting one together. There is no depth chart, obviously, not that there really ever is one, but there's none. But I have all the players listed, and in case somebody calls in and wants to talk about one of the new signees or something, I'll have all the bio information, and just to talk knowledgeably with the coach. And again, the bottom line is any of those shows, they're for the listener. The shows aren't for us, although I love doing them. These shows belong to the fans. So it'll be heavy phone calls because the fans want to know a lot of things. They'll talk about all sorts of stuff. I'm sure they'll talk about renewing their season tickets and how that deadline has been pushed off to May the 20th. There's all sorts of things that the fans want to know. So we'll be talking about that on A-Day Saturday, a week from this Saturday.
Well, we'll look forward to that, and more information will be available, of course, all across social media channels for the Crimson Tide Sports Network, Alabama Athletics, and, of course, RollTide.com. Eli, thank you so much for joining us on Facebook. This has been a fun conversation. I know the fans have really loved it from some of the comments we've seen below, but just thank you for your time, and we hope you and your family stay healthy during this time, and we look forward to seeing you, hopefully, next time back on campus at the University of Alabama. But Roll Tide, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Good. And I'm glad they let you out of the bedroom and let you come into the living room.
We got the Eddie Lacy print behind me.
Lacy, you got a shaker behind you. It's nice to see you out of the bedroom. I'm glad they let you out.
All right. Appreciate it, Eli. We'll talk soon.
All right, Raj.
All right. Well, Crimson Tide fans, that has been a lot of fun with Eli Golden. Again, this conversation was all thanks to Alabama One Credit Union. They're Tuscaloosa's best credit union and best mortgage lender. Alabama One, of course, offers low-rate auto, mortgage, and business loans, plus protection for it all with Alabama One Insurance. Make sure you visit any of their 9 locations across the state or online at alabama1.org, a proud partner of Alabama Athletics. We certainly thank all of you for joining us. We'll have another Radio Classics interview coming up on Friday at 3 o'clock, and we'll have more information available, of course, here on the Crimson Tide Sports Network. But thank you so much. Good afternoon, and Roll Tide.